Now, of course, it was no longer safe to stay with Uncle Jaap. So next, what could they do? And again, through connections and friends, he found a small children's home in Breda that from time to time took in children who had been very ill and went to this small children's home to convalesce, as this home in Breda was near the woods. Now, I'm really stressing it was near the woods, because it was thought in those days, if you were ill, for instance, if you had TB, tuberculosis, the best thing was to go to a sanatorium in Switzerland, because the mountain air was supposed to be very good for you. Or you went to the seaside. Now, that's all well and good, but Breda, there are no mountains in the Netherlands, hillocks here and there, and then no sea nearby. So the woods were the third best thing, because it's supposed to be very good air, no pollution within the woods. So that's why, and I can tell you that when I visited Breda about 5 years ago, that house is still there. Unfortunately, I couldn't go in because the lady who lived there now was very ill, and it wouldn't have been appropriate for me to visit. But I remembered staying in this house because the house was run by a lady called Sister Pop. She'd been a nurse, and then when she finished nursing, she decided to have this children's home, and she was helped by 2 either fostered or adopted children, I'm not sure. One was called Beb, and she was a qualified nurse, and the other one was called Francine, who I have no memory of Beb, but I have a memory of Francine. She was a few years older than I am, and she used to play with me that after the war, when I used to go and stay with Sister Pop on a visit, she used to play with me. So that's a nice memory. And the last time I actually saw Sister Pop, she was quite elderly. She had moved from the big house to a bungalow. And although I don't know what the year is, I know it was Ash Wednesday, because people came past her window with little grey crosses on their forehead. And as a Jewish girl, I'd never even heard of Ash Wednesday, and I certainly didn't know about people with little silver crosses. But actually, if I closed my eyes, I could still see those people coming past. It was a remarkable day, and sadly, that was the last day. Now, so Sister Pop, another very brave lady, because not only was I there were 11 other Jewish children in her care. And what I'm going to do now is, I'm going to take you to 1992. Seems forever. You are too young to remember 1992, I think. But anyway, in 1992, in the Netherlands, a conference took place. And the conference was the Hidden Child Conference in Amsterdam. And 600 people from all over the world came to this conference. Each one had been a hidden child during the war. And now they lived in America, in Israel, South America, England, wherever. And they'd all come together to the Netherlands. And when I arrived there, I was met by a lady who had befriended me, who lived in London. She had lived with her husband in New York. He worked for British Airways, and she had been instrumental in organizing one of the first Holocaust hidden child conferences in the world. And when she was traveling back to the Netherlands, actually she was Belgium, but she was going to the Netherlands, a Dutch journalist sat next to her, and he asked, would she organize a hidden child conference in Holland, and she had agreed to do that. And Nicole met me and said, now then, Hanneke, it's lovely to meet you, but why have you come to this conference? Good question. And I said to her, I have come because I would like to find out if there's somebody here who was also with Sister Pop and could tell me something about me being a baby, because obviously my mum couldn't tell me much about after I was 10 days old, she hadn't had me until I was about 2.5. So she couldn't tell me very much. And Nicole said, put a little note on the notice board, and then maybe you're lucky, maybe you're not. So I wrote a little note which said, my name is Hanneke Dye, which is my maiden name. I was with Sister Pop during the war. If there's anybody here who was also with Sister Pop, I would love to meet you at 6 o'clock at this notice. And then I went in the conference proper, which was a very emotional thing. You were actually put in groups of your birth year. So I was with people who were born in 1942 and 1943, all with horrendous stories. One had never known his family because his parents had perished, and his uncle had perished, but his uncle had been engaged, and the lady he had been engaged to took this boy in and really brought him up as her own son. So that was one story. Another was, I only tell you a couple, was another gentleman who seemed very troubled. And the reason why he was troubled, he was taken in by a family who gave him a different name and a different religion. And when at school it was exam time, the names were read out, who's here, and Hanneke is here, tick. You know, Peter is here, tick. So this chap hadn't had a turn, and he put up his hand and said, nobody read out my name. And that's when he discovered that he had a different name, because they'd called out his real name, and he didn't know his real name, so his hand hadn't gone up. And he had been troubled all those years with what happened to him. And that's enough, because I was so emotionally drained by the time this conference was over, and it took me almost 2 years to get over that conference, that I promised myself I would never attend something like that again. Right, now back to my mother. My mother passed away in July 2006. In fact, on the 14th of July, it was her wedding day. And 3 months before, my husband Edward had passed away. And so that year, as the Queen once said, was my annus horribilis. I had the task to actually tidy up her apartment. And I came to live in Great Britain in 1965. So I was now back in Holland, staying with one of my nephews, who took me to my mother's apartment every day. Because at that time, I had 3 sisters. My youngest sister had died of cancer when she was only 54. And then the twins, Maria had had a heart attack, so she was recovering but couldn't help. And her twin sister Mareke actually had been diagnosed with Parkinson, so she couldn't help. So for 6 weeks, every day, I was in my mother's apartment, and that's where I found most of the things that I normally show on a PowerPoint. But some of them I've got here. So those photographs here were actually on my mother's sideboard, so I knew about those. But I have a book of photographs, and of course, not realizing I wasn't going to do a PowerPoint, I didn't bring that. But I found photographs of my mother having just given birth of me, of Sister Pop, and Mrs. Sontjes, of course, who I've already mentioned. And it was quite a big task. And in her kitchen, I found 2 tins, and I'm going to hold 3 tins. I'm going to hold up 2 for you. And I'm just going to briefly go like that. I'm going to ask you to think what you think is in those tins. They're just silvery and khaki. Anybody have a guess? Ooh, it's very quiet. Well, as nobody's put their hand up, I'll ask you to tell me what's in those tins. Tea, absolutely right. Now, my parents were hidden in a town called Helmond, which I'm going to talk to you about in a minute after I've had a drink. They did translations when the British came to freedom in that town. And because of that, as a thank you, a Scottish regiment actually gave them this tin, which is very small, and it says Scottish Co-op at the back. And this khaki tin was given by a soldier of the Northumbrian Infantry Division or the Royal Service Corps. Because, where is it? I must have left, oh here. This book was published, and I want to talk about that in a minute. Now, so those were given, and then there's a third one, and I'll just rattle it. That's just to confuse you, really. This tin Gold Flake cigarette was given to my parents by an American soldier. And if I open it, you will find there are cloves inside, but also the original corrugated cardboard that's inside, which held cigarettes. And although it was given by an American, this is a British cigarette produced in Bristol. So these are quite historical now. So that's that. Now, I was staying one day with one of my sisters and didn't sleep very well. Got up in the morning, during the night, before it was morning, and I found this book on the coffee table. Of course, it's in Dutch. And it says, under the protection of the angel Gabriel, in memory to the liberation of our good town, Helmond. Ah, Helmond. That's the town where my parents were hidden. And earlier in my talk, I talked about Uncle Jaap and my grandfather having bicycle connections, customers that had bicycle shops. Well, Uncle Jaap had found a place in Helmond with the family Flemings, Mr. and Mrs. Flemings. And Mr. and Mrs. Flemings had this bicycle shop. And when I opened up this book, and it'd be difficult to see from the back, maybe at least you can see there's a photograph at the top. And that photograph is of my parents, is my sisters, and it tells the story of my parents being hidden by Mr. and Mrs. Fleming. So the next morning, I said to my mother, why didn't you tell me about the book? And she said, darling, don't believe everything you read. You know what the press is like. And that was me dismissed. Now, in 2019, I received an email from a lady in Helmond, Jolanda Baker, who was a member of the Historical Society there, and she got in touch with me to want to find out what I could tell them about the people, Mr. and Mrs. Flemings, who had risked their own lives to save my parents and maybe other Jews as well. And she invited me to come to Helmond, and that's what I did. So July that year, just before COVID, I had never been to Helmond, and she took me to the street where the house and the shop were that Mr. and Mrs. Flemings had been in and where my parents had been hidden. Unfortunately, the house didn't exist anymore, but in the same street, there were exactly the same houses. Shop at the front, much more modernized. Shop at the front, the main house, and attached a lower building in the same material, which was Mr. Fleming's workshop, where he mended bicycles when people had flat tires or needed a new steering wheel or saddle. And that had been my parents' first hiding place, his workplace. And I remember occasionally my mother would give fragments, and that year was a very cold winter, 1963 it was, when it was very, very cold. Anyway, she had been remarking in 1963 about the sea being frozen, which I remember being frozen, walking on the sea. And so she said, The problem was, in the winter, the heat from the house came into the workplace. But in the summer, as there was hardly a window, it was absolutely freezing in there. And that's all like a little fragment of the puzzle of what had happened during the Holocaust. And then the raid started in Helmond. And Mr. Flemings took fright. And he said, get rid of the Jews. Understandably so. So Mrs. Flemings asked my parents to come out of their hiding place, and Mr. Flemings joined them, and they all had a cup of coffee or at least a drink together. And then Mrs. Flemings gave them the bad news, and the bad news was, I'm sorry, but you'll have to leave. We can't really have you live under our roof anymore. Now next to the house, and on the picture that I have, which I'm sad I can't show you, is a ginnel. And that ginnel is still there, even though the house isn't there. And when my parents went out of the front door, the shop in other words, with Mr. Flemings, not knowing where they would go, Mrs. Flemings was in the ginnel and actually beckoned them to come back in the house. So they got back in the house and straight upstairs, and on the landing was a chair, and on the chair were some cushions, and she pushed the cushions to the side, and then she pointed to the ceiling, and there was a hatch in the ceiling, and my parents had to pull themselves up into the space under the underdrawing, and that's where they were for the rest of the time with Mr. and Mrs. Flemings. And Mr. Flemings didn't know he was still hiding Jews under his roof. So now food became even more difficult than it was with ration cards. And as a child, I didn't like spinach. I love it now, but not very nice. So I would say, push my plate away. And we had to eat everything that was on our plate. I think most of you probably have to eat everything that's on your plate. But especially the people who've been through the war and had terrible hunger, it was even more important that you ate everything on your plate. And then my mother shouted out one day and said, we were only given one piece of bread. And that piece of bread, they each had one slice. Mrs. Flemings had managed to get some food up to them. And she took a little piece of the bread and put it in her skirt. And when it was night time, she gave that small piece of bread to my father. And as she said this is what she told me, I couldn't stand listening to his stomach rumble. And that's why she gave that last piece of bread to her loved one. And ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, that is true love, to give your last piece of bread to your loved one. And always remember that. Yes. So then, back to Yolanda in Helmond, she produced a little book which said, lest we forget, we must never forget. And in there, by chance, is a picture of the bicycle shop, which I've just mentioned. So I leave that open, and you can clearly see the snicket or ginnel next to it. And it also shows a picture of my parents with me. And it's strange, when I asked my mother in the big book why it was a picture with my sisters who were born in 1945, so after the war when Holland was free, she couldn't really answer that. She just said, I don't know, and that was that. Right, so I don't actually know. I know that the south of the Netherlands was freed before the north of the Netherlands. Mrs. Flemings was a very religious person. In Holland, the south of the Netherlands is mainly Roman Catholic and the north is mainly Protestant. And that is still roughly the same today. And Mrs. Flemings used to go to church every single morning and obviously also to confession. And her priest had said to her, why don't you bring your guests to church at midnight mass? It was near Christmas. Because they could just come out of their hiding place for a little while. And this is before Mr. Fleming's got fried. So one Christmas evening, my parents indeed left their hiding place and went with Mr. and Mrs. Fleming's to church, which wasn't actually very far from the house. I've seen where the church is. And I was expecting my mother to say something about how beautiful the church was, or what the priest had said, or the people they'd seen. Absolutely nothing. What she talked about was, it was wonderful walking to church because I could breathe in fresh air. And we take fresh air for granted. Even in this beautiful church and outside, you don't even think about it. But because in the underdrawing, there was only very little light, and so they didn't get much fresh air, and she found that the most important. So it's very interesting to think how people had different thoughts about things. Anyway, that was an outlook. So what have we learned from the Holocaust? I would say very little, because you know what's happening in the Ukraine, which I already mentioned. Buildings being bombed, churches being destroyed, schools flattened, and people totally disoriented. And that's very sad. Now, this year's Holocaust Memorial Day was perpetrators, bystanders, witnesses, and there was another one, refugees. You must have found examples of this anywhere in my talk, as you found about social justice and injustice. So another year it was Stand Up to Hatred. And what I'm going to ask all of you to do, together with me, to pray that we will all stand up to hatred, to have respect for each other, whatever the color of our skin, our religion or background. And then we together can say, yes, we can. We can make a better world. And I'll finish with a poem. And the poem is called Candles by Bathsheba Diane. Candles of joy and candles of sorrow. Candles we light wherever we are. Candles for Hanukkah, the festival of light. And candles for Shabbat. Candles for Havdalah, the end of Shabbat. All candles of pure, pure delight. So many, many candles. All kinds of shape and all kinds of color. All of them candles of pure joy. But then, only one candle is right. To remember someone who died. A candle for the soul. And more candles we light in silence and in humor. 6 candles, a memorial for the 6 million who lost their lives during the Holocaust. Thank you for listening to me.
Questions, sort of from our year 9 students. So at St Peter and St Paul's, for those of you who aren't at St Peter and St Paul's, we spend time thinking about virtues and things that are important to us about, areas such as forgiveness. And so one of the questions students have asked is it easy to forgive those who have committed or are the perpetrators of the atrocities of that time? Is that something, we talk about forgiveness, don't we, in school? Is that something that's very easy?
I was brought up to hate the Nazis for what they did to my family, and I've tried very hard not to hate. In fact, when Peter's Rotary went to Berlin, I actually had to think very carefully, would I go to Germany or not? And I plucked up courage and went to Berlin. And we were shown around the town by a student. And when we came to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, which is a very, very powerful memorial, somebody had tipped him off that I was a Holocaust survivor, and he said, I won't talk about my parents and grandparents, but we learn about the Holocaust in Germany in history lesson. And I had this fantastic need to shake this boy's hand. And I actually very slowly did it, but I felt so proud. In my way, through him, I was forgiving his parents and his grandparents. Maybe I wasn't doing it full-heartedly, but it was my way of showing some forgiveness. I don't know if I could ever forgive the people who actually killed my family, and that's a different matter.
Okay, so another one here. So as your years advance, in the nicest possible way, as they do for all of us, obviously we'll become more and more removed from that time of World War II, and therefore it can be difficult maybe for us to think about what that might be like. But also for people like yourself who are survivors of that period, can you sometimes feel alone and like it's difficult to find someone who you can perhaps talk to about those events, who perhaps has an understanding of what it might have felt like?
Well, not far from here, in a small village called Lexden, there is the National Holocaust Museum and Educational Centre, very worthwhile a visit. And there I meet with people who have also gone through the Holocaust, quite a number actually in concentration camps, and some of those are brave enough to stand up and share with the school children, students, or the public their stories of horror and trauma. And we've all been videoed, and even last week there's now an exhibition in the Huddersfield University. A lady from there came with a cameraman to actually video me, so that one day when I am no longer here, that story is still available for people for research, and I think that's very important.
Okay, thank you. There's a number of different questions in here that are on a similar sort of theme. So this idea of sort of strength. So how do people who are in those very difficult circumstances find strength? What gives you that strength? You know, sometimes it can be challenging, can't it, to be wearing the right uniform? So how do they actually sort of manage to work through?
Is this during the Holocaust or after?
Both, I think, potentially.
Well, during the Holocaust, at this conference, there was actually a man who was a twin, and his brother was taken in by a Catholic family, and out of gratitude, he stayed a Roman Catholic, and his brother became a very orthodox gentleman. Not quite a rabbi, but almost. So there's a difference, but still they found strength in each other as brothers, and actually were able to talk about why one became an Orthodox Jew and the other became very religious Catholic. So there was strength from that sort of thing. And after the war, it took me a long time to actually give these talks. One of my granddaughters asked me to come to the school, primary school, and in those days they had little recorders, and the teacher and they had prepared talks. And once I started, somebody asked me, oh, can you come and talk to us? And can you come and talk to us? And initially, I used to break down every single time. I found now strength in myself that it is my duty to actually share this with you, so you will have a better life and you will understand to actually stand up to this hatred which I mentioned, so that you together make a better world. And that strength of all doing it together will bring you forward and bring peace in this world, and certainly in Great Britain.
I think that's a really lovely message. So if I could just have another round of applause, please.